Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Prisons and Probation Research Hub's digital events. This is our second one this academic season, and I'm really delighted that you've taken the time out to join us live today. Just a little bit of background about our events. We're committed to kind of transferring knowledge across different sectors, and I'm absolutely delighted that Jim King, our presenter today, accepted my invitation to come and tell us about his good work. I was lucky enough to meet Jim a few years ago now, and strangely in Sweden, so not on either Scottish or English soil. And I was blown away by his tenacity and the good work that he's been doing. He speaks today in the capacity of the Secretary for the European Prison Education Association, which has done some great work as well. And Jim has led on a very valuable and important report that he's going to reflect on. He's also the head of learning and skills for the Scottish Prison Service, so obviously his vast experience feeds into that. So I'm absolutely delighted to welcome Jim today to tell us and reflect on prison education. A great title for a presentation, a hard sell. So over to you, Jim. Thanks
you. Thanks very much, Victoria, and good afternoon to everyone. And I would also like to endorse the welcome by Victoria there, but I'd also like to take the time at the moment just to thank Victoria and her team, especially the kind of the technical people in the background, Faye and Mark, who have been great in helping to ensure that this can go live today. So thanks very much for taking the time. And as Victoria said, today I'm speaking in the capacity as the Secretary of the EPEA, but also as author of the report, which was presented to I was very privileged to present it to the Council of Europe in Strasbourg last year. And this report was fundamentally based on the 1989 recommendations on prison education that were produced back in the kind of mid to late 1980s by a group of forward-thinking educationalists, one or two of whom may well be in the audience today, and I'd like to thank them for their work. But as you'll be aware, that back in 1989, there wasn't any proliferation of the internet or indeed any type of kind of digital technology that was available to in education or for learners in the way it is today. Moreover, educational research over the past 30 years in conjunction, with other areas that we know lots more about, for example, learning difficulties and disabilities, have very much informed, policy across a range of jurisdictions as to how we address the issue of prison education. So hopefully over the next half hour or so, I'll be able to give you at least a kind of overview of the underpinning principles, the background, and indeed, some examples of good practice in prison education today. If anyone has any further questions or would like more information on any aspects of what I speak about today, my email address will be on the last slide. But in the meantime, if I could address your attention to the first slide, that basically shows us, that back in 2017, we received an invitation from Europris, and again, thanks have to be given to Europris, who basically led on the proposal to review prison education. And I'd like to thank Christine as well, the Chief Executive of Europris, for our ongoing support, in this area. This was also supported by the European Prison Education Association, and it involved 10 countries, so representation of 10 countries from across Europe, who formed a group, to look in depth at prison education policy. And as you'll see, the link is there to the report, which not only has the final version of the report, but it also has a spreadsheet containing a number of good practice examples in prison education. And the next slide is basically just demonstrates some of the underpinning principles of education in Europe, basically stating that the education is, indeed a human right, and it should be accessible to everyone on that basis. And again, the documents here, the references to that, just fully support that perspective, that has been accepted by the Council of Europe and indeed by jurisdictions across the European continent and beyond. The next slide takes us to the beginnings of that discussion, of the representatives from each of those jurisdictions from the 10. We decided, to supplement or to further inform and build on not only on our experience and insights that we individually held, but we also wanted to commission a survey at the time, just to look a bit more in depth at what some of the issues were and indeed remain to be the case. So we drafted a questionnaire. It was sent out to 30 jurisdictions across Europe. We had quite a high return in terms of completed questionnaires, which amounted to about 73%. So it was quite a high volume of return. And the types of questions that we answered, that we asked, that we wanted to question, was really around the number of jurisdictions that actually aspired to implement the original recommendations on prison education. And unsurprisingly, the majority of those jurisdictions came back and says that they very much supported, the underpinning principles and intentions of the recommendations in prison education. However, the responses to the questionnaires demonstrated that there was still quite a bit of a journey to go in relation to the actual realisation of those principles and intentions in a practical sense. What we discovered, and it'll probably be no surprise to those of you who are here today, that because of the very much education is based in terms of its location and its culture, it is very much often affected by justice policies. It is very often implemented not so much with different intentions, but perhaps with different priorities. And what we have seen, and what we did see, not only from the questionnaire, but from our own experiences, is that policy making, differs significantly across the European continent. Very often, prison education policy, sometimes it doesn't exist. Where it does exist, it's sometimes developed by prison authorities. In other areas, it is developed by justice authorities. In areas that are regionalised, or where there is appropriate devolution, it's perhaps federal authorities that decide what the policy is. So consequently, we end up with a whole disparate range of intentions and the vision for education across various jurisdictions. But there are some key factors that we see that are constant across these policy areas. For example, what actually constitutes education differs in terms of sometimes we have sometimes the arts are included, sometimes the arts are excluded, sometimes physical education is included, sometimes it's not. Generally speaking, the approaches are fairly focused on low-level basic skills and employability. Now, as you can imagine, these areas of intervention in terms of basic skills and employability are important areas for development. They're very often important areas for individuals, but often they are promoted to the exclusion of other areas of activity. And perhaps, there's a bit of imbalance in terms of what we're trying to do, and essentially, in neglecting the underpinning principles of the original recommendations, which sought to promote education that addressed the needs of the whole person. And by the whole person, they meant all aspects. their cultural, their educational, their physical, their mental, their spiritual needs in terms of educational opportunities. And that's quite a tall order, you know, and very often it has perhaps been easier to look at a model whereby it's easier to provide a standard provision that's related to the local school, or access to education which provides access only to the equivalent of the 11 plus or the school leaving certificate for that particular jurisdiction. So we saw these differences in policy, we saw differences in terms of what constituted education, what was included, what was excluded, but also in terms of access, who was eligible for access. The slide that I showed earlier there talked about education as a fundamental human right. In some jurisdictions, education had to be based on your previous attainment, or it had to be based on the length of your sentence, or it had to be based on your whatever was available at that time. So there's quite a few gaps there in terms of what is being provided in reality and what the aspirations are and continue to be across Europe. And obviously, in relation to new technology, well, about half of the jurisdictions that we spoke to have embraced, for example, access to the internet, for serving prisoners. It is very much supervised and limited at the moment. So the other thing that came out very strongly is that perhaps there is not the regular updating or indeed the kind of policy reviews to update in terms of when new research or when new information comes on board. And that's particularly useful in terms of, for example, learning difficulties and disabilities, which obviously affect quite a significant number of the prison populations across Europe and across the world. And I can just move to the next slide, please. And again, this is some of the recommendations, that we changed. We very much agreed that the underpinning principles, the ethos, remained as sound today as it did 30 years ago. However, we just wanted to ensure that the recommendations were relevant for the educational context today and what was required to ensure that we could improve and update and build on those sound principles, that were established as, within the recommendations 30 years ago. So recommendation one, we included information technology, we included libraries, and again, to reinforce this concept of the whole person, is to enable people to reach their full potential whenever possible. Recommendation four, justice agencies and prison authorities, again, trying to extend that beyond the narrow perimeters, if you like, of particular prison authorities, but the realisation that prison authorities can't do this on their own. There has to be collaboration, there has to be partnership working, there has to be that through care, there has to be that, from custody back into the community, the continuity of education, the continuity of engagement, and that has to be promoted, between external collaboration along with prison authorities. Again, training for prison staff in the methodologies of adult education, so that it's not a remedial type of education. Very often the people in prison, the people in our care, have had poor experiences of education. The lives have been blighted by addictions, by mental health issues. So we have to be careful we're not just providing a very narrow focus which kind of reinforces the earlier failures. An adult education approach talks about co-production. It's not about, an old-fashioned banking system of education whereby the teacher is a person with all the knowledge and the learner is just the empty vessel waiting to be filled with this education. It's an engagement, it's a dialectic, it's building on the experiences and insights that people have in their lives, but primarily it's about returning to education in its true sense. It's about evoking what is in people. It's bringing forth, educar from the Latin, to bring forth and to tap in, you know, to people's inherent skills and talents and abilities, very often latent talents. But we can't just provide, you know, basic skills teaching and, you know, mathematics classes or English classes that perhaps, you know, present as reinforcing the failure of earlier years. We have to be innovative, we have to utilise the arts, we have to be innovative in the ways in which we engage so that people will engage and continue to engage and to become all that they can be. So if I could just move to the next slide there, please. And what we looked at as well, just as in a very holistic view, we looked at what has happened in the justice arena over the past 30 or 40 years, where we've seen that from the late 70s, in effect, you know, where penal welfareism kind of broke down, where rehabilitation, you know, was a kind of principal focus, the focus on the marginalisation and the focus on some of the wider contextual issues that impacted on prisons and prisoners. But what we've seen was a fundamental ideological change in the late 70s and the 80s, where we've seen that, you know, the emergence of monetarism. We saw the managerialism coming in. We saw a complete change in philosophy towards one of crime control, but, you know, very much people living in gated communities, very often marginalised communities were excluded. People started to redefine the whole perception of justice back on individual responsibility, the marginalisation of the offender, allocating, you know, the responsibility of that, if you like, for offending back in individual. And it became very often a populist policies which dominated, and those populist policies served the needs of politicians and indeed found its way into policy. And what I want to look at very briefly is how that policy, you know, that's very well articulated in Dave Gallen's book in 2001, The Culture of Control, and how that affected from looking at that really from an educational perspective. So if I could move on to the next slide there. And what we begin to see from the next slide is academics such as Roos, you know, looking at the difference between this philosophy which moved, like I say, to populist policies, to punishment, you know, to incarceration, to the much more risk management and risk assessment of prisoner population, the introduction of cognitive skills programs, very much the dominance, if you like, of cognitive skills programs in relation to educational programs, more liberal, open type educational programs. Now, and Roos, you know, said that, you know, this provided a kind of paradox between the aims of imprisonment as opposed to the aims of education, you know, which was about individual liberation, about individual freedom coming from the self, not being imposed, if you like, from the outside. And Anne Costello, who's a colleague, works in Mountjoy Prison in Dublin, and very often Kevin Warner, colleague, have written extensively on this, you know, and it can show it in some of the rhetoric that's employed, you know, the contrast, the book, the Norwegian policy document in prison education called Another Spring, you know, with the American functional and instrumental approach, you know, from the reducing reoffending through skills and employment. So again, if I could just move to the next slide here, which again, the other areas of policy, what we've seen coming into the arena here was this focus on basic skills, very often with the connotations of ignorance and lack of understanding, you know, that very much on a functional basis. You know, the Moser report published in 1999 and the Adult Literacy and Numeracy in Scotland published in 2001. Both these documents highlighted the high percentage of the lack of functional literacy within the prison population. In some respects, you know, those percentages are misleading, because very often, although they're higher levels, they're very often portrayed as illiterate, you know, using a very pejorative term, whereas the reality and the complexity is, is far more nuanced. For example, the definition, it very much depends on the definition. If you're using something that's not just a functional definition, the ability to encode or decode text, we have to look at how people understand, how they comprehend, into how they form ideas, express opinions, they communicate. These are all literacy activities, and literacy is a social practice. It happens within a social context, and like anything else, like in any other kind of education, we know that people primarily learn through relationships and through engagement and through personal reflection, and those are the areas that we need to respond, rather than saying a very simple black and white, people don't read and write, we need to teach them to read and write and get them a job, which in itself is no bad thing. And it's great that people can access skills development and employment. However, a significant percentage of the prison population are nowhere ready near employability. They have mental health issues, they have severe addictions issues. In terms of the short-term prisoners, they're spinning out in and out of prison at a tremendous rate, and it's very difficult to do anything significant in that time. So we need to adopt, we need to adapt, and we're very fortunate in Scotland that we work closely with our education partners, Fife College, who are really experienced and very effective at addressing the needs of our entire population, short-term, long-term, young people, women. And this is why it's important, based on the principles of our adult education, to provide the education that meets the needs and aspirations of the individual. If I can go to the next slide here, please. Yeah. And this is where the principles that we learned in Scotland very much came into the principles of adult education have been around for a long time. In 2013, the Scottish Prison Service undertook an organisational review, and this was a vision that they came up with, and this was the mission. And as you can see, it was all about developing person-centred, asset-based approaches. So this is doing away with any kind of negative approach. It's doing away with, the negative perceptions. It's saying, okay, what are you good at? What would you like to do? What are your aspirations? How can we help you? Building the education around the needs and aspirations of the individual. And that was the way forward. That established the principle, and that's the basis upon which we have been working, since that time. If I could just go to the next slide, please, there. Yep. And by 2016, we had undertaken a whole range of work, including, like I said, going back to 2000. The Adult Literacy Report was very fortunate to deliver that personally in prisons, beginning back in 2001-2 for a period of 5 years. I had quite a deal of autonomy to explore, a range of interventions across the arts, across language, and we built on that, working closely with our partners, Fife College. We really started to move towards a more creative approach to education. That resulted in the publication of our Learning Skills Strategy in 2016, very much endorsed by the Executive Management Group in the Scottish Prison Service, and very forward-thinking in terms of, that everyone in their care has the opportunity to engage in creative and flexible learning to unlock potential, inspire change, and build individual strength. That's the kind of core. And the remainder of the presentation here, I'm going to show you some examples of that, that were very much had some very positive results. And just to show what can be done, with the right approach, with the right approach to creativity and recognition of the needs of those individuals, and how we can provide education that meets their needs and aspirations. So if I can move to the next slide. One of the things we started to explore a whole range of arts projects. We looked at developing drama, music. We even had an opera in Shotts Prison, which is long-term adult males. And part of that whole project, across a number of prisons, we had an arts project that was called Mirrors. And this was a painting from a young man in Poland, young offenders. And I think it more or less says it all. It shows how he feels about himself on the outside in the colourful representation at the front, and in the background, it shows how he feels about himself when he's in custody. And very much Poland and young people have been a kind of major focus of our interventions over the next few years. And if I could just go to the next slide, please. This is the STIM magazine. This is long-term prisoners, not only in Shotts prison near Glasgow, but we also have kind of subgroups in other prisons. The dominant principle here is this is a magazine that has been developed by prisoners, for prisoners, edited by prisoners, and it promotes creativity in Scottish prisons. You know, it highlights poetry, creative writing, interviews with those who are coming into prison, partners, you know, to work with people across a range of issues, whether it be addictions, mental health, education, you know, creativity. There's a whole range of things, and that's published 3 times a year, and it provides not only, you know, a very high quality and award-winning magazine. It provides, you know, an ideal outlet for the creativity, you know, for those in their care to get published and to read and to, you know, to absorb and to reflect and perhaps to, you know, move towards education and creativity for themselves. And again, the next slide here is a project we embarked on a couple of years ago at Glenorchy Prison in partnership with the University of Edinburgh, looking at astrobiology. We thought this is, you know, it was quite groundbreaking, as you would imagine. I'll exclude any puns about going beyond, but essentially we introduced a project on astrobiology, not knowing whether this would be a success or not. It was very much a success. A lot of the guys in our care, the longer term prisoners, embraced this. Not only did they start learning about the STEM agenda, about science, technology, engineering and maths, not only that, they began to look at, there was a lot of spin-offs in terms of poetry, in terms of creative writing, and even in terms of the first ever composition of Martian Blues music, believe it or not. Not only this was supported by the European Space Agency and the British Interplanetary Society, and a book was published, and we very much continue with that. An academic seminar was arranged for last year, international seminar in Edinburgh had to get cancelled due to COVID, but very much a success, and we built on that subsequently in the Mars project. And not only is the science education important here, but also the scenarios that are painted to, you know, to those who engage, you know, because what it does, it engages some real creative thinking in terms of citizenship and democracy, in terms of leadership. You know, they talk about what would happen if they were stranded on Mars, when they have to self-provide, who would lead, you know, how would those leaders be chosen, etc. So they very much talk about all the positive aspects of citizenship and democracy. We could just move to the next slide as well, please, here. And that's just an award. I'll move to the next one, Mark. Just the award from that. And again, that's the performance of the Martian Blues number at Glenorchy Prison back in 2019. And again, Mark, we just move to the next one. Cell block science is a really innovative project that we've undertaken in collaboration with the University of St Andrews, Strathclyde, Edinburgh, Aberdeen. And this is where a group of academics, postgraduate students, have went into prisons and they've engaged in, again, the STEM agenda, science, technology, and in a very practical way. You know, they've engaged in teaching the basis of various aspects of science, whether that be anti-smoking, you know, whether it be about the health and hygiene, or whether, you know, it's been very much fun type activities involving families, doing it at visits. And again, another award-winning project, you know, won the Herald Award for partnerships. I think it was 2018. Maybe the next slide might show that, Mark. I think there's an awards picture there. 2018 partnership, the Herald Awards. And then if we just move on to the next slide again, some of the other projects that worked in collaboration with Fife College, teaching the guys, you know, the skills, working with dogs. We also had the Pause for projects where some abandoned dogs are brought into Parliament, the young people, we pair them up together. They write reports about the dogs and look after them. And this one here is from our open prison, where the guys very much started in partnership training the dementia dogs. The next one, Mark. Again, this is some of the project theme learning. And this helps us overcome any of the remedial approach to education. We get things that are interesting to people, and we bring in speakers, we have events, and this was very much the same. We had Holocaust survivor come in, talk to some of the young men at Palma, and they had an event, they painted pictures, and they highlighted this particular aspect of history. And these are the types of things that really do engage the people in our care. If I can move to the next slide again, Mark, just to finish off. Again, this is a project we did a couple of years ago. We're in discussions with Andrew Davis about not only looking at gangs, looking at the futility and the fatality of gangs. We ran this in Berlin in Lomas prison, very popular. Got people really thinking and reflecting, not only about gang membership, but about their wider environment, about how they can challenge it, about communities, very sociological approach, but very much looking at alternative ways of being. And the next one, Mark. Yeah, this is just a book of some examples of creative writing at Scottish Prison that was published last year, based on individual experiences. We have had quite a few of these types of publication, again, in partnership with Fife College, working closely with them. And the next one, Mark, is the Savage Alley Awards. This is awards. I'll hopefully finishing this, so I've got time for some questions. Savage Alley Awards is very much a partnership collaboration between SPS, Fife College, and the National Health Service locally at Cottonville Prison. And it's very much an approach whereby everything was constructed around positive activity. And the more that the ladies engaged, the more points they accrued, and the more benefits they got. They could have makeup and haircuts and all sorts of benefits. They could access other interventions. It proved to be very popular, and again, it won the National Herald Partnership Awards 2019. It was also shortlisted for the UK Times Educational Supplement Awards, which were unfortunately cancelled due to COVID, but it did get it got highly commended from the online presentation of those awards. And just moving on there, Mark, to the last. Very briefly, one of the things we've been working on for a number of years now is trying to tackle the prevalence of learning difficulties and disabilities within the prison population. We now have a very comprehensive screening tool available in all our public sector prisons, which offers opportunity for individuals to be screened, and it's an indicative screening across 5 domains: cognitive ability, literacy and numeracy, and AD, attention deficit, social communication, and coordination and organisation. So it looks at all these areas, and it gives us insight where there may be potential problems that we can take forward in a case conference with NHS partners. And that's us at the end there, Mark. There's another slide or two. Yeah, that's us. So that is very much a whistle-stop tour of what we're trying to do in the recommendations of prison education for Europe, and also just working back a bit there to show some of the underpinning examples of good practice from a Scottish perspective. But very much, I'm just going to finish on that by saying that Europris are still taking us forward, and we hope that the Council of Europe will adopt these recommendations as we go forward. And I'm just going to end at that, and thank you very much for listening. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jim. Excellent overview of both the good work that you're doing in Scotland and the contribution that you're making to sort of the European agenda, Jim. Fantastic. I've got some questions for you, and it was really helpful to obviously listen to you and hear about certainly the survey that you did for the EPEA. And I'm just wondering, you know, as a result of doing that survey, as a practitioner, and having the role that you have in the Scottish context, what bits of best practice did you take from undertaking that survey? Is there anything that comes to mind that's helped you to shape those recommendations? What kinds
Absolutely,
of things?
yeah.
What kinds of things kind of were flagged up as a result of you doing that survey?
Yeah. Well, one of the main things that I think, Victoria, was the need to have a vision. You know, the need to have that strategic oversight. We were very fortunate when the Executive Management Group of the Scottish Prison Service agreed to our vision in 2016, which we're about to review this year, actually, in partnership with Fife College, who are core providers. And again, very forward thinking, but we also include the academics from Glasgow University in our strategy group, as we did previously. And that survey was actually undertaken by the Scottish Centre for Crime and Justice Research, just to make sure we were one step away, to give it that independent, you know, approach. And actually, one of the serving prisoners at the time, and you know, worked on that as well, which was great. He was in the open conditions at the time. So, a vision, because of the, as I said, the disparate approaches that are inherent across Europe, the real need to have a vision to and some goals to work across, you know, and indeed to move towards and to reinforce the need for an adult approach, you know, because very often, like I said, the approaches from the local school teachers would come, or still do come in, from the local schools, or go back and forward, perhaps don't have any training in adult education, and are delivering only a school curriculum. You know, if we're going to be serious about addressing the needs of the adults, then we have to build on what their needs and aspirations are. So that was just one. What was the vision? But we thought the examples of good practice would help others to replicate that. And this is why we included a spreadsheet of good practice along with the report, you know, so that individuals can then engage in that activity if they so wish.
Yeah, excellent, thank you. And I think you noted in your what struck me in your presentation, how you were sort of drawing attention to this idea of a functional approach to education, and how that doesn't suit, you know, certainly the adult population. I've got a question from Christina Quinlan. I know she works at Montfort University, a colleague of mine. Thanks, Christina, for your question. And her question, I think, links to that point about, you know, the complex issues in attempting to engage with a broad prison population. You know, it's such a diverse population as well, and with different needs in different circumstances. And what, if anything, can be done to address the complexity?
Absolutely, yeah. And that's one of the real challenges. You know, where do you have a prison, where do you have an increasing prison population? You know, and that's what we've seen. You know, Dave Garland pointed to that. You know, the increase in use of incarceration. We've seen that across the UK, Europe, and in America. What then happens is, you know, the more people, then the more pressure is put on prison staff, then the more difficult it is to have this individual approach. And when you have disparate populations, you have a prison with a number of different populations, with young people, or with women, or with long-term and short-term, with romance, it becomes increasingly complex to orchestrate the movement and ensure there's equity of access to educational interventions. So that is one of the challenges. And one of the ways we've tried to address that is by having an annual learning plan for each prison, which is a tripartite discussion between myself and Fife College, senior management of Fife College, and senior management of individual prisons. And what we do is we draft a plan for that year, ensuring that, and again, this includes learner feedback. We get regular learner feedback from Fife College, and you know that the prisoners engage in that. So we know what we want. We know we've obviously got finite resources. You know that there's obviously areas that we can improve as well. You know, so we're always looking at that. But it's a document whereby it's regularly reviewed. It's reviewed twice a year, and you know, we try to meet those. But it is a challenge. There's no getting away. Of course, it's a challenge because very often, and the point that Vernon Munzo made in his 2009 report to the Council of Europe was that very often cognitive behavioural programmes, of which there is very positive attributes towards them, but sometimes the focus on that or the demands on that, can impinge upon the individual's ability to access other types of interventions. And it's like everything else in life, it's getting the balance right.
Yeah. And you talked, I think, quite vividly about the sort of deficit model that has been traditionally adopted, and how you presented the Scottish vision and how the jarring and I suppose antagonism between the aims of imprisonment and the aims of education, and trying to move away from that deficit model and saying, look, these are person-centred. Is there anywhere in Europe that has adopted those kinds of views of education, as a result of doing that survey? Is that illuminated elsewhere? You don't have to name places, but
apart from Scotland, you mean? Well, the report has been very well received. My colleagues who took part, and I believe some of them are here today as well, from a number of countries across Europe, we all agreed that these were the principles, and they all made that commitment, and to work with the EPA, to further. But we can't impose these things. This is why we're hoping that the Council of Europe will adopt the recommendations, and once they're adopted, it gives that additional emphasis to them. And then that's something we can look at and we can say. But most practitioners that I speak to in general, fully agree with the approach. It's very often it's a policy that the difficulties are perhaps the underpinning ideology at times doesn't fully appreciate. That we really need to get people to change from the inside out. Very often, that's what learners tell me. And they use concepts like haven and harbour and sanctuary for attending education services.
Got you, yeah. And sort of moving to the examples that you've highlighted, so diverse. And I think when I met you in Sweden, you were talking about the space project.
Yeah.
Which that blew me away in terms of moving away from, I suppose, traditional subjects, but also how that embraces, as you said, democracy and citizenship and thinking about community and everything. And one of our audience members today, Eleanor Jones, has asked, what's happening to all these great projects at the moment with the current situation of the pandemic? How are you overcoming, or how are other educational providers that you're aware of overcoming those challenges?
It's been a real challenge, Victoria. Last year, like most jurisdictions, we went into lockdown last March. However, because of the close working relationship I have with Fife College, they were very, very quick to adapt and to innovate. And within a matter of weeks, we had a whole range of learning packs. We had the beginnings of DVDs on different subjects being produced, and podcasts and updates to the internet system. We had visits to residential halls to ensure the exchange of materials, the utilisation where they existed, because the estate is very disparate, where they existed, the infrastructure for TV, prison radio, so we're trying to do as much as we can. The partnerships at Open University Scotland have been tremendous as well, in terms of working round about some of the difficulties to ensure the exchange of higher education access material and assignments. We then reopened, education was reopened again in early August, albeit with significant reductions in capacity due to physical distancing and safe working practices. However, only last week we have had to close down again temporarily due to the virulence of this new strain of the virus. However, again, as we speak, I'm continuing to work with Fife College. We're in a much better position because they have already developed a whole bank of materials, and it's just a case of getting them distributed and continuing as much as we can in this particular period until such times as it's safe to open again. I'm understanding, from other jurisdictions is they're very much doing the same type of thing, and it's certainly prompted the need perhaps for kind of more of the technological infrastructure, and that's something that we are fully engaged in at the moment as well.
Well, obviously technologies of great interest to me within the prison context, and some of the barriers that creates not only for education. I wanted to pick up on a point that you made, Jim, which I found very inspiring, about differences between what is understood as education and how from your survey that you noted that some people exclude, or some jurisdictions exclude or have excluded things like art or PE. But then you talked about the sort of spiritual aspect to learning as well. Have you got anything more to say about that? Share your views on that.
Yeah, well, I think it's really going back to the founding principles, going back to 1989. But when the forward-thinking educationalists looked at it, said we need to address the needs of the whole person. So it's not just about some perceived literacy and numeracy deficit, or other kind of cognitive deficit. We need to try and engage with all a person's needs, whether they be, educational, emotional, spiritual. And by that, I mean, I can mean, I was very fortunate. I was able to do some research in Chotts Prison a few years ago myself. And one of the things that became clear from those who were attending education, very often they came from a position of no formal education or a very limited background in it, and they were doing extremely long sentences. We managed to get them engaged, and they were now engaged in full-time education. And what they said was, they very much saw education as a sanctuary, as a harbour or a haven. They looked to that. It was something which very often their offences were committed when they were young men, perhaps under the influence of drink and drugs. And what we try to do in terms of education is this, it's a liberal approach, it's a critical approach, it's about developing, as you know, it's about relationships, it's developing those positive relationships and trying to promote self-reflection and to try and manage that space, if you like, between what is in the world as opposed to what people want it to be.
Yeah.
That gap between what is and what they think it should be is very often where a lot of the issues emerge in terms of the anger or resentment or indeed frustrations. That can manifest into negative types of behaviour, and very often trying to get people to reflect on their backgrounds. Very often a very narrow prism. The culture, addressing the very often toxic subcultures. And I'm talking about the west of Scotland, sectarianism, sexism, and areas like that. These are the things that we challenge, and we continue to challenge. We have projects on racism, on domestic violence. We explore these things, and we challenge appropriately through these things. And again, mental health and well-being, and indeed mindfulness and yoga, working in partnership with the likes of the Phoenix Trust. These are all aspects. This is why we have to look at the whole person and develop people holistically rather than through a particular box, if you like.
Yeah. That's helpful. And we've probably got a lot of listeners today who are practitioners working within this sector. And you mentioned in terms of your recommendations about partnership working, which I think, that kind of bridging between those different agencies and providers and resources. What advice can you give to practitioners, Jim, in terms of brokering partnership work? It's not easy, is it? It's not easy.
But having said, one of the things, the partnerships have been great for us. Like I said, we've been very fortunate that Fife College are very forward-thinking as well. And I work closely with them and the universities. And the quid pro quo for the universities is that they get access into prisons for their students or postgraduate students. They can engage in teaching. We do about Napier University, a very good project in Edinburgh. We have reading groups through open book learning. We have, like I mentioned, that the Astrobiology and the science project. So the quid pro quo is the postgraduate students get a real insight into the real world and teaching ability. And what we get is we get the additional skills. We are able to broaden and deepen, enrich your curriculum and insights, and obviously new people coming in and out, new perspectives, new challenges. So it works both ways, and universities in Scotland have been challenged by the Scottish Government also to get back to their roots, to get back into the communities, to tackle disadvantaged areas, disaffected communities, and it helps them to do that as well, because as we know, people in prison are amongst the most marginalised within our communities.
Yeah, absolutely. Just to end then, Jim, I'm just thinking, in terms of our audience, what and this is a question that was posed in our seminar before Christmas. Is what could listeners do to assist, progressive enterprise in prison education? What can I do? What can listeners do? They may be practitioners, academics, members of the public. What can we do to either get involved or support, your vision?
Yep. One of the things that's been very successful for us for a number of years now has been the project theme learning. As you know, in prison, you've got a class. They're all at disparate, levels of ability. So very often you're having to work with one or two or small groups, on themes. If you have a project theme, you can work on a project across different skills levels. So people can contribute to that particular project. And we usually have them time-based. We have them maybe for 10 weeks. The Holocaust picture, was one of those. Work on it for 10 weeks. The Commonwealth Games, Brexit, independence referendum, where you get speakers in, you invite speakers in, you have the pros and the cons, the for and the against, and we tackle real life problems, things that people are interested in, what's highlighted in the news, drugs, alcohol issues. Let's explore them. Let's challenge people about their views. All these things. So the projects themselves take on a life of themselves. We end up with spin-offs in terms of creative writing and poetry. And very often at the end of these projects, people are becoming saying, I never really thought about that way.
Yeah.
Because they've been challenged, or that they've not really heard that there is alternative ways of thinking, that they can change their thinking, that they can grow and develop. And it's back to what I said at the very start. But education to me is to evoke, it's not to train. We can all be trained in different things. It's to think and to think critically, and to have that ability to self-reflect, and ultimately to change, to be a better version, the best version of you that you can be.
Yeah, excellent. Okay. And it reminds me of when you were talking earlier about how, sort of the impact on the self, and education, and sort of that idea, your title of your projects, unlocking potential and transforming lives, and that sort of spiritual end of things, and models of recovery.
Very much so.
Yeah. Okay, great. Just one last thing. I was absolutely blown away with the images of the magazines. Was it Stir magazine?
Stir magazine, yeah.
Where can we get hold of a copy? Is it available to the public? Can we buy it? Can we?
Well, I'll speak to five colleagues. That is obviously the associated cost of production, but we do have quite a wide distribution network. It's going strong, but I'll certainly be able to get you some copies sent down, and we can take it from there.
Or if it's available online or something. It looks absolutely stunning, high quality produced items. There's nothing lovelier than a glossy magazine. It looks fantastic.
As I say in Scotland, pure quality.
Fantastic. Excellent. Oh, I'm absolutely delighted you welcomed my invitation, Jim, and you've given us a lot to think about, and I think you've made me rethink some things. I think just to end, how has your practice changed through the years if you're doing it? Just one more question, we've got time.
My own personal practice.
Yeah.
I don't get to teach very much these days. I occasionally do. I say my engagement initially was during the Pathfinder project, when I had 5 years I had a bit of a free hand, which was great. So I was able to go in and explore, introduce readers and writers in residence. I went down to Dartmoor, brought up the Storybook Dads project. That was great, to start off with. Then that developed into different manifestations. We were able to look at film, develop drama with prisoners. Made a couple of films. One went to Kessler. We made a drama that was circulated across, and it really made by the individuals. It's co-produced, so based on the principles of adult education, co-produced with the learners. My job involves in and out of the prisons all the time, working closely with Fife College, and where I can, I'll still go and maybe do a session with the guys or whenever I go, and it's really just it's good. It's always good because that's where you can hear a lot of the concerns and very often a lot of the praise for what we're trying to do. We're certainly not perfect. We've still got our own challenges, but I think we've established that the underpinning correct philosophical approach, and then that allows us to build on that, and we'll start this year to develop a new strategic view for the next 5 years.
Yeah, fantastic, great, and that's music to my ears. This sort of discussion around co-production and the value of co-producing, learning and materials and thinking and solutions and problems together with communities. Fantastic. Thank you very much, Jim. I hope everybody's enjoyed today's session. I'm sure you'll agree. Jim's been a brilliant presenter today. Just want to flag up a couple of things. We're going to be doing some more digital events. We've got one planned in February, which is listed on our DMU website. That's going to be reflecting on LGBTQ plus and criminal justice. We have the wonderful Kath Wilson from Montfort University, and also Dr. Sarah Nixon from the University of Gloucestershire, reflecting on their work in practice and LGBTQ plus issues. Then in April, we've got the wonderful Lucy Baldwin talking about the impact of her work and how she's helped to change policy and practice for mothers in prison. And then we have a collaborative event which may be of interest to you, Jim, on penal arts and wellbeing. Okay, and that's in June. And that will be an extended programme. It's a collaboration between several universities, including De Montfort, NHS Leicester, and a wonderful charity called Soft Touch Arts. They've been working with people in prison and in the community settings to produce wonderful artwork, including an installation of a prison cell. So we've got a lot on the agenda. If anyone's got any ideas for seminars or presentations or discussions, do feel free to contact me. I'm very committed to, transferring knowledge out into the public sphere. The more we talk about this, the more we can reflect and help each other. And as Jim says, if you've got any further questions for him or myself, then don't hesitate to contact us. And thank you so much for joining us today. Faye has told me that we've had a large number of people attending, over 100. So that's brilliant. Thank you. And I think for those that have signed up, should have the YouTube link for the presentation potentially, I think, but we'll discuss that. Thank you, guys, and I hope you've enjoyed the show. And cheers, Jim. I'm going to give you a virtual hug.
Yeah. Much appreciated.
Take care, everyone. Stay safe.